Hello, everyone. My name is National Master Matt Fleury for the Seattle Chess School. For those of you subscribing to this channel, I am now going to offer some opening advice in many different openings, and we shall call this series Making a Case For. And today I would like to make a case for the move b6 against the London system. The London system, of course, is the first three moves that we have set up here for white. This is an extremely good opening that has become very popular lately, and it's necessary to come up with a good defense with this when you have the black pieces. The defense I'm going to recommend is not that popular. In this position alone, there are several moves that have many fans. Of course, c5 being one of the main moves. We also have bishop to f5, developing the bishop in a more natural way. And we have the move e6, which all have their fans, and these moves are quite good. Also, g6 transposing to a Grunfeld system is also quite good. I'm going to recommend b6 because it is not that popular of a move, but it has a lot of flexibility to it. Our intention is to put the bishop on b7, even though it will be behind this pawn here. We also will have e6 followed by knight d7, and we shall be very flexible with the dark bishop once we get to that moment. Now, the usual move for white here is knight to f3. And we are intending to play bishop to b7. And you might be wondering why I recommend a system where we fianchetto the bishop behind a pawn like this, where so the bishop has no influence on the king's side. There's two reasons for this. Number one is that since black is going to have a nice grip on the light squares after e6 and knight to e4, this bishop actually helps out with this particular plan. The other reason is that if white wants to actually get anything out of their position, they will eventually have to either work to play e4 later on or to play c4 either immediately or also later on. Once those moves occur, then we have a very simple plan of just simply capturing whatever shows up either on e4 or c4, and this will help out our bishop immediately. So, for example, if white were to play a move like c4 transposing to a queen's gambit, we could have the option of actually capturing this guy at some point, either right now or in a couple of moves, and this will open up our bishop for action. We could also delay it one move, and at some point we could capture, like for example, the old battle of the tempo. So this means if white makes a move with the bishop, since this bishop has moved once, we can now capture on c4. And when white captures back, we actually gained a move, and we actually have a much better bishop in this position. So this is just one of the basic ideas. The other basic idea is that if white chooses to play in strict London formation, for example, playing pawn to c3, which is a normal London move, we play e6, which will help develop our dark bishop, knight bd2, fairly normal moves, sort of slowing down knight to e4 and developing the knight centrally. We're going to make the same move on our side. And then white usually plays bishop to d3. Also, bishop to e2 is a possibility. Also, h3. These are all London style moves. And if white chooses to stay in this London system, then we, as playing the black pieces here, we have some options, including knight to e4, clogging the center. We have bishop to d6, developing the bishop and putting pressure on their London bishop. We can play a6 at some point, just in case we need to guard the b5 square. We can also play for c5 in some cases. We also have a flexible king. We might not necessarily castle short as quickly as possible as in normal opening systems, which would say develop a piece and castle as quick as possible. We could do this, or we could save this move. We don't necessarily have to do this, but it is certainly available. And this is our basic setup here. So this, and I don't know if this has a name for it, but we will call it the Tartakover system. This is actually something that Grandmaster Tartakover invented a long time ago, where he would play a normal Kali system, but then very soon after play a move like b3. And the idea here was to put the bishop on b2, again, fianchettoing behind a pawn. But if black ever plays a move like c5, then we can entertain the idea of capturing this guy, which will free up the bishop. Say, for example, something like c5, bishop to b2, knight c6. And at some point in the game, we can actually capture on c5, which will resurrect our bishop. So we're actually going to borrow this particular idea to play against the London system. Now, the great thing about our system is that whether you are a knight f6 player against d4 or whether you are a d5 player against d4, both those types of players can use this system. So if you play knight f6 and they decide to hit you with a London move, we can easily just play pawn to d5. They will play pawn to e3, and we can play b6, and here we are. If you are a d5 player, and instead of playing the Queen's Gambit, they decide to play the London system, we can simply develop our knight, pawn to e3 and b6, and here we are once again. Okay, so now one of the theories in this, the theory of this idea is that we are going to fight against whatever white does here in the most economical way. So for example, knight to f3 was probably the most usual move you will see in this position, and we will develop our bishop to b7. And this takes fairly firm control of the e4 square. Now, in this position, white has basically three ways to handle this type of thing, which is to either go into full London system with pawn to c3. They could try to play pawn to c4 and go into a Queen's Gambit, or they can play it in what is known as the Jobava London style by playing knight to c3. Usually when knight c3 is played, this has some flexible ideas. Possibly they want to lift up the queen and castle long really quickly. In some cases, they might play knight to b5 and try to attack c7 very quickly using these two pieces. Against this early attack, I would recommend the ultra simple a6. Just simply guard the b5 square, prevent this particular attack. This does not develop a piece, and it does not help out in the center in a classical way. But what we were simply doing is diffusing the early aggression contained behind knight to c3. So by not allowing either bishop or knight to get to this particular square, we will then continue on as normal with e6 and knight d7, and then we shall wait for the bishop. Okay, so that should give black a fairly decent position, which is simply a6 followed by e6. Okay, so another way that white could make an early attack is to play a move like knight to e5. This is usually a good move in the London system anyway, and it outposts the knight, and it of course attacks a number of really nice squares. Even g6 can be nice sometimes. Okay, in this particular case, I would say that playing knight bd7 is a perfectly good move, and this is part of our system anyway. We're just going to develop our pieces like this, play e6, and then worry about the dark bishop after that. In this particular case, because the knight is on d7, we also have certain options such as exchanging pieces off, which will also diffuse what white is trying to do. However, in this position, there is a small little trick that we could try to play for here, and that is if white plays bishop to b5. This makes a pin, and it also dominates the c6 square. So it looks like that this type of maneuver by white is trying to punish this early bishop to b7 move. However, once again, we can rely on our old friend a6, and we can easily play this move to attack the bishop. And even here, we are offering a little bit of a trap. For example, if white wants to get a little greedy and play knight to c6, this looks like that we need to get rid of this guy because of the fact that it's attacking the queen, and all these pieces are starting to invade. But it turns out that we can actually just simply play queen to c8, and this wins a piece for black. So this is a small little trap. The threat is a takes b5. If the bishop backs up, we can just simply kick the bishop, and this wins the knight. If the bishop moves back anywhere else, we just take the knight. So a small little trap here. Um, and if bishop to c6, also trying to dominate the c6 square, we could just simply capture this guy and play queen to c8. And this knight will not be able to stay here for much longer. And nor is it actually very useful for this knight to be here, even though it looks like it's occupying a weak square. In addition to that, our bishop that was on b7 was certainly worse than the light bishop counterpart. And so exchanging that piece off is definitely helpful for black. So this means that early attacks by white against this particular system can be diffused quite easily. So we don't have to worry too much about that. All right, so the systems that are going to be more common are the ones involving either c4 or c3 and developing in normal London style. Against c4, I would say that this is probably white's main move, getting into a queen's gambit declined, especially when black plays e6. And this is a known position. Many strong players have played the black side of this. Many strong players have played the white side of this. The one thing I would say is white has actually got this position from a slightly inflexible way because of the fact that they play bishop f4 so early. So for example, going back to the beginning, the normal way to get positions like this is queen's gambit declined. White can play knight to c3 and then play knight to f3. And in this kind of positions, black, of course, has many moves with the bishop. You could play bishop to e7. Some people like bishop to b4 as a move. And so on bishop to b7, there are those that like to play bishop to f4 rather than the normal or the classical, I should say, bishop to g5. And in this position, after castling in e3, then black, in addition to playing c5, which is, I think, the main move, we can also play b6. So this way, this is very similar to our position, except for the fact that we haven't moved our dark square bishop. Usually this bishop is already on b7. And this is... okay, so let's set this up again. E3, B6, knight F3, bishop B7, pawn C4, E6. So here's the position that we get. And because we haven't moved our dark square bishop, we have a couple more options. We might go to E7. We might go to D6. We might play bishop to B4, whether it's check or not, depending on the situation. But in these kind of positions, because white has played C4, black is eventually going to capture this pawn, which is the point, thus releasing the bishop. Or if white captures at some point, then we have the option of capturing with the knight, and this picks on white's second move. Now, of course, white does not have to go in for this exchange, but the fact that we already have the centralized knight and the bishop is unleashed, this should give black some reasonable play. You might, as the students who are watching this particular video, you might have to do some work here in trying to figure out, you know, where the pieces go and what, you know, the correct ideas are. I mean, obviously knight to d7 is a move. In these kind of situations, we will also have c5 as futuristic counterplay for black. We will still have to develop the bishop and castle in these kind of cases, but I would say that this gives black a somewhat easier game, and we could be very happy with what we've done with our bishop. Our bishop was formerly clogged, and a couple moves later, it will have a diagonal to work with. Okay, so now that just leaves the c3 systems. Okay, so with this is what most Londoners will play for. E6, good move, just simply releasing the dark bishop. Knight bd2, knight bd7, and we'll give white bishop to d3. This is, I mean, a very good post for the bishop, and it's usually where it needs to go, especially if black is going to castle short. White will have something aimed that way. Okay, now in this position, black actually has a number of options, which is why this line is being recommended. We have a very flexible position. We could, you know, try out a move like, say, bishop to e7 and castle short and just play solid. So for those of you that like this type of thing, you could play in this fashion and eventually try to play for pawn to c5 and have a fairly level position where you have good development and a defensible position. There is also bishop to d6, which is a little bit more aggressive since we are now in contact with the dark bishop. We never really have to be afraid of this particular trade because not only does black have a good grip on the e5 square with this pawn and this knight, black also has a grip on the e4 square with this pawn and this knight. And that should give black some reasonably good chances with this kind of a center. Okay, so not only that, but we have the major resource with all of this position, which is knight to e4. This sets up all kinds of different possibilities for black. Number one is that we could reinforce this pawn with f5, thus turning it into a Dutch defense and holding on to the e4 knight, even have more of a grip on that knight if you need it. Another thing with knight to e4 is that we might have the can opener g5 followed by h5, some sort of kingside attack. And as usual with knight to e4, we also have bishop to d6, combining central space with central pressure and kingside pressure. So we have some basically an option for all different types of players. Okay, so now, the final thing I would mention. Okay, actually, let's going back to knight to e4. There is one little scary thing that, or looks scary for a second, and that is what happens if white actually captures the knight on e4. If white, of course, captures with the knight, this loses the pawn takes. So here we have a simple fork. Whoops, we have a simple fork winning a piece. So we don't have to worry about that. If they capture like this, which actually, I don't know if too many people have done this, we capture here and we have one white's very valuable bishop for a knight. This bishop still isn't on a wonderful diagonal, but by removing the light square bishop from white, black has better chances of utilizing the light squares. The only thing to know about this position is what happens if white plays knight to g5. This looks like it makes a very nice double attack on e4, and any way that we try to defend this, we're going to run into some problems. Like obviously, if we play f5, this runs into knight takes e6, which wins for white. So that's obviously a blunder. If we play knight to f6 to defend the pawn, this does weaken this diagonal a little bit. And I would assume that queen to a4 or even queen to c2 and piling up on this pawn is not going to be very nice for black. But it does turn out that in this position, black actually has a really good move, which I guess can be considered another trap in this position, which is to play e5. And what this does is it attacks the bishop, and it's trying to divert the bishop away from the knight. So this means if white cowardly backs up, then we can take a knight for free. Yay. Okay, so that means that the only move that white has is to actually capture this guy. And when this happens, then black has a very nice move in the form of knight to c5. And it turns out here that in spite of the fact that black is down a pawn, black is the one that has great attacking chances. The threat immediately is knight to d3. And if white gets out of this by simply castling, then we have the move h6. And this knight obviously cannot capture because it is defended, cannot back up like this. So that means the knight has to back up like this. And of course, this gives black some really good chances on the king side. These pieces are not well positioned. This knight is going to come into d3 anyway. And black has got an excellent compensation for this pawn and really good attacking chances. So now what this means is that back in this position, white, of course, has some, regular moves like castling and so forth. But putting this knight here on e4 causes some problems. By the way, I should mention that another great thing about having this knight on e4 is that if you absolutely need to, you can actually play a strategy involving trading. You could simply put your bishop on d6 and try to trade bishops, or you could try to trade knights on d2, and this will give you another position where you can defend a lot better, but it is certainly an option. All right, now to the final thing that I will go through here with this particular opening is an actual game, and actually it reached this position. This position was reached. The person playing white is International Master Roland Berzinch. The person playing black is Grandmaster Yevgeny Sveshnikov, who is a very famous grandmaster. He is the inventor, of course, of the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian. And he actually, Sveshnikov played this position very recently. This was 2019, and the game actually achieved this position. So here, white played another typical London move, which is h3. This is designed to give the bishop a garage to back up into, just in case he starts getting kicked around. So in this position, Sveshnikov actually chose to kick him around right away with bishop to d6. So again, if you're afraid of capturing and you notice that these are doubled pawns, what you should also notice is the central grip that these pawns afford. So this is actually quite good. It also gives black a half open c file where you could possibly place a rook or a queen someday. And we don't have to worry about this particular maneuver. So white did not capture this particular bishop, but just simply castled. And this allowed Sveshnikov, one of the, I guess one of the bonuses of playing this particular variation is that since we have not castled quite so early, we do have the option of castling and simply protecting our king. But Sveshnikov actually used a great weapon that is available in this situation, which is to play g5, the can opener attack. We're actually going to just simply use one or two pawns, and we're going to bother the king's side. Again, white could capture here, but chose not to, actually just ran back. And Sveshnikov just said, all forward, h5. So because we haven't castled, we do get the option of this pawn storm. And as soon as we move the queen, either to here or somewhere, we actually have the option of castling big. So this way the king will be safe on the queen's side, and we could start an all-out assault on the king's side, which is exactly what happened in the game. So here, white used one of the major resources that the London player has, which is knight to e5. And this looks like a really good move, simply centralizing the knight and trying to stop any g4 pawn move from winning a tempo on the knight on f3. Sveshnikov, in my opinion, actually played this brilliantly. What he did is he actually took this guy, but he took it with the knight. What a great move. The idea here is that if when white captures with the pawn, then the c5 square becomes available to this knight, and we can play here, and this will be a great outpost. And also, if you capture with the pawn, then it also clogs up the London bishop, and then we wonder why we even put this bishop on this diagonal in the first place. On the other hand, if he chooses to capture with the bishop, then we could simply get rid of the London bishop right away, and we can always back up the knight to c5 this way. In fact, this actually might be a good move already, just simply preparing to move the queen and castle and resume our pawn attack on the king's side. Something like this. In the game, white took with the pawn, and here there is a serious double attack here on the E knight, and also the G pawn can't move forward. So the way that Sveshnikov solved this problem is that he just simply captured. Now, that knight on E4 looked really, really great, but the point is that when the queen is diverted away by capturing back, G4 is now suddenly underguarded. So this means that he gets a chance to do the can opener routine and play G4, and already he has the threat of capturing the pawn, which will open up the king's side on the G file. So in this position, white played f3. So I mean, it's hard to judge these moves. I mean, black is going to open up the file one way or the other. So this move, at the very least, gives the queen some space to work with. It gives f2 for the rook. White might be able to run away with king to f2. So as a defensive move, I know it looks really strange to play this way, but some files are going to get opened anyway. I mean, if white actually captures queen h4, is a serious problem here. In fact, the entire file is a serious problem. So F3 is probably as good a move as any. Of course, here we capture, and now we have at least a file open towards the king. So here what black would like to do is castle long, but we need to move the queen. And so Sveshnikov's next move is also very good. He simply plays queen to h4, winning a tempo by attacking this pawn, forcing white to defend, and this will give him time to castle long and use the d rook to come over to the g file. So after this, queen to g2 is the defensive move, and here he plays castles. So this, of course, is already threatening the immediate rook to dg8. And we could say now that black's opening is finally over once this castle's moved. So every piece has been developed, minus the h8 rook, but the h8 rook was helping out with the pawn storm. And I would say the result of this particular opening is clearly in black's favor. Black has a much safer king. His bishop is still clogged behind the pawn, but now that this pawn has clearance in front of it, black always is threatening some sort of d4 clearance sacrifice in unleashing the bishop onto the king's side. So all it leaves is for black to do is to time this push correctly. So at the very least, this is the big threat. So white tried to defend himself with bishop to g3, kicking the queen away, and we just simply Sveshnikov just simply ran away. Okay, king h2, again trying to defend himself and get out of the lineup here. Rook dg8, and he gets out of the lineup finally with queen to f2. So there's no more pin. White's last two moves look like good defensive moves. Queen f2, h4 was played, attacking the bishop. Bishop moves to f4, and then Sveshnikov decides to attack in the center with f6. So again, trying to remove this pawn from the center, which I think is going to happen by force. Take. And this, of course, is now making his center more mobile, and he's getting more and more chances on the king's side. So here, with e5 being a big major threat, Berzins defends with king h1, kick, bishop h2. So that was the purpose of king h1, to make room for the bishop. And then he finally plays knight to c5. This move wasn't really going away, so he throws it in now, hitting the bishop. The bishop backed up to e2. And here is just a matter of trying to find ways to gain tempo and play for the attack. Actually, I believe black does have a good move here. So if you want to pause the video and try to find the good move, I'll give you a couple seconds to try to find it. All right. So for those of you that did see it, you guys might have noticed that h3 was extremely weak. So it's simply attacking it should be a big problem. So simply queen to f5, attack the pawn, which basically wins this pawn by force. Also, queen to e6 was playable. But anything that attacks h3 is just simply going to win it. And white tried to get out of this by going into an end game, which is, a fairly good defense, especially if you're going to lose a pawn. Sometimes going into an end game is the right idea. The pawn was won, and here, black's, of course, his position is overwhelming. White exchanged a rook and then came over here to offer another rook, and black more than likely has more than one way to finish off this position. Black actually chose a very simple way to do it, just simply trading off rooks again. Queen takes, and he's just happy being up in this end game, up a pawn. He has a good center. The pawn he is up as a passer. The king is, maybe it's not under defended, but it is certainly not in a good spot. Here, Sveshnikov played a great move, bishop c6. I like this move, making air for his king and recognizing that queen g8 could be counterplay. For example, if he plays queen g8, now we can actually play king to b7, and the king is safe. Without this move, the king could not go to b7, and so queen g8 might have been a really nice threat, actually, playing for a lot of checks, especially since the king won't be able to block out you know, too many. I mean, the king will have some difficulty blocking out all the checks. So he solves this problem now by going bishop c6 and giving him some air to run. And only at this moment, I feel that white actually really blundered, and I believe it was a touch move error. He touched the bishop, and Berzins played bishop to d1 because there was really no other move for the bishop. I think what he wanted to do is play bishop to a6 check, but of course that's guarded. So therefore, maybe white's last chance was to play b4 here and try to kick the knight away from a6 and then try to land the bishop to a6 check. Unfortunately here, the bishop was touched, so he had to move him. He played bishop to d1, and finally, after all of these moves, this bishop got into the game by this clearance sacrifice d4. So the pressure is coming on to here. Also, this pawn might push to make a pass pawn or possibly take something, weakening white's pawns. But this is basically the beginning of the end. After d4, white chose to offer a queen trade, which was accepted. Take, take. And then black just simply captured a pawn here, making another passer. So black has 6 pawns to 4. Actually, make it well, white got 1 back on bishop takes, but then white played knight to d3, and this, of course, is threatening knight takes b2. It's threatening knight takes e5. Maybe a fancy move like knight to e1 might come in handy because it will attack the f pawn twice. And so here, this is basically a winning ending for black, and white in this position very quickly played bishop to e2, which hung the bishop, and white resigned. So this is the result of the B6. So this is my case for the B6 defense against the London. And if you guys want to try this out, and message me here at Lee Chess. My name is Bleeorg, Bleeorg. If you want to try this out, and message me at Bleeorg and show me some of your games. We shall do a follow-up video later on where we show some of the viewers' games with this line, and we can see this kind of stuff in action. This will end it for this particular video. This has been National Master Matt Fleury for the Seattle Chess School, and good luck to you in this particular line, and hopefully I made a good case for the B6 London defense. Thanks very much, and we'll see you on the next one.